So it says compassion in this translation, but I want you to know that the actual Greek word in there is splogetomai. I'm not going to pronounce that right. It means gut wrenching or gut churning. But the word compassion in the New Testament is not this kind of nice and friendly, like, oh man, that feels so, it's like, oh, it's like painful. It's visceral. It's embodied. Which actually gets back to the Latin root of our word compassion, compassio, which means to suffer with. Sometimes we paint compassion as this like friendly, polite, nice, like, oh, I care about you. Like we confuse compassion and empathy sometimes. Like, oh yeah, but compassion is actually about this kind of like embodied connecting in someone's distress. And Jesus has this feeling when he sees the crowds. When he sees them, he has this gut churning, like almost, I don't know if I would call it a need, but like a deep solidarity with their plight, with their helplessness, with their experience of being harassed. It literally pains him. And I think about that sometimes in terms of thinking about, are we pained by our own suffering? Let me ask that in a little bit different way. Sometimes I think that we suffer, and at least for me, the narrative is that I shouldn't, right? Like, what do you have to complain about? Your life's great. You got everything going for you. Or like, you're letting this bother you? This shouldn't even be a thing. Many of you have some self-denial language that sounds something like that, right? What happens when you start actually being compassionate to yourself? What are some of the thoughts that enter into your mind when you start actually being kinder to yourself and more generous to yourself? Guilt. You want to say a little bit more?
I feel like I shouldn't be so easy on myself.
You shouldn't be so easy on yourself.
Right, I shouldn't just like let it go. It feels lazy.
Feels lazy. There's a lot. How many of you are afraid of being lazy? Yeah, that's a big one. What else? What happens when you start being compassionate to yourself? What is the narrative that starts popping up?
Must be getting weak.
Must be getting weak. Because you need it, right? How many of you have anxiety about having emotional needs? I shouldn't need things or people. I should be self-sufficient, rugged individualism, just like that Marlboro commercial. He doesn't need lung cancer treatment. He's fine. We don't like the idea that we might be lazy. We don't like the idea that we might have needs. What else? What comes up when you start being compassionate to yourself?
Whiny.
Whining.
What do you have to whine about?
That like maybe if naming it is taking up space, right? Like who am I to complain or whine? Who am I to center myself in my own feelings in this moment? Other people have it so much worse. I don't deserve that spaciousness. Other people need it more than I do.
But on the flip side of that, I mean, you are compassionate to yourself, as long as you're not being whiny. It's joyful.
Sure. Does anyone have a good distinction between being honest and being whiny? Like what's the difference there? Can anyone split that hair?
Yeah. I think whiny is more like an ongoing thing that does not ask for change or transformation. It just like is happy whining.
Sure.
About whatever it is, and honesty is necessary actually to address things, and you're not get stuck in the whiny stage when you're honest. That's my.
Sure. A nuance I might add to it, but I think is very consistent with what you just said, is whining is not in the present moment. It's about the past or the future. But if we're really in the present moment of what we're experiencing, and we're really naming this thing that's really happening to us right now, when we call that whining, what are we doing?
Diminishing and dissing it.
Yeah, shut up, stop feeling, stop talking, you're not welcome, you're not worthy, right? We got to be careful about how we use the term whining, because if we start labeling our real needs and our real feelings as whining, we are doing, I mean, this is dramatic, we're doing violence to our own spirit, right? I like the word ruminating better than whining because I feel like it's more descriptive of a way of being. Whining, I feel like we can just apply to all kinds of stuff. Go ahead.
When I just stopped for a moment and felt compassion for myself was shocked. And myself, the pain level came down, and there was a warmth, like a comforting of a foggy, misty blanket. And it's very positive. Things that we feel for other people, but we don't turn on to ourselves, we can help heal the pain and the brokenness inside ourselves if we turn to it.
That's right, you felt surprised, but then also that kind of warmth, that gentle attention was able to remain. I really do think that if we can allow ourselves to arrive in the moment with where we're at, we can allow ourselves to receive what God has for us. But if we can't allow ourselves to really arrive in the present moment, if we're constantly resisting and battling and pushing away, I'm not sure we can receive what God has for us and what God intends for us and the liberation God intends for us. Whenever I think about Jesus, and I try to imagine him like hanging out with me, which is a fun exercise. I always notice that there's two things that happen whenever I imagine Jesus like kicking it with me. Number one, I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, I always imagine that he is just still and receptive. That he's really listening to me. And he's seeing through whatever I'm talking about, like the issue, and he's seeing through to how I really feel about it. He kind of cuts through like, this is pissing me off. He's like, yeah. And how does that feel? Well, I feel really angry. He's like, yeah. And what are you angry about? Well, I'm really bummed. I really didn't want that to work out that way. I'm really disappointed. And he's like, yeah, that's really disappointing, isn't it? And I just feel myself settle in as he is still. And then the second thing happens. Once I know for certain that he really gives a shit about how I feel, he's really present there, he's really with me in full divine grace and love, he says, buddy, I'm going to need to call bullshit on some things.
What's that in Aramaic?
We could work that out. We could figure out what that is in Aramaic. But I swear to God, every time I think about Jesus, he settles me down with his loving attention, his willingness to be graceful and gracious, honoring exactly where I am, and then calls bullshit. My problem is I try to do this part first with other people and myself. How's that going? How many times have you been hanging out with somebody and you just really wanted to call bullshit? And then you did, and that conversation didn't go that well. Right? What did you get immediately? Resistance, defensiveness, anger. Who do you think you are? You don't know how hard this is. You don't know where I'm coming from. Right? Now who's the enemy? Now who's the problem? Is it the thing? It's you. And now you have to decide, are you going to eat crow? Are you going to calm down? Are you going to admit that you just screwed up? Or are you going to double down? Or are you going to be like, you know what, we don't have to talk about this? And then that rift is there. That emotional damage that you just did is there. And then you have to figure out, well, are we going to forget about this? Am I going to apologize later, awkwardly? Am I going to find some other way to talk about it? Am I going to talk about somebody who's way worse than me so that we can get back together? Right? All the calculus that I wouldn't have to do if I remembered how Jesus calls bullshit on me. And I slowed down and I arrived first. See, I think when Jesus comes into this party with all these tax collectors and sinners, right? And what do we really mean by that? Tax collectors are the people that are complicit with Roman occupation, right? They're working for the man, working for the enemy. And sinners could be a whole collection of things, but basically, when we see that term, we should just know these are people that other people feel comfortable judging, right? So whatever category that is almost irrelevant. Like everybody's just like, yep, those are trash people. And whatever you already populate that category with, it doesn't really matter. Just the fact of a concept of trash people. And probably those people think that they have internalized that belief. They are trash people. Here we are, a bunch of trash people. The only people we can hang out with are these people that are known collaborators with the empire. Because nobody wants to hang out with them either. And guess what? All of those people feel lonely, isolated, separated, disappointed, frustrated. And maybe, just maybe, the fact that they're all together is because that's a place where they can actually feel those feelings. And everybody can be like, yeah, me too. This sucks. And they're not trying to change each other. And I just imagine Jesus rolling into that room, and maybe that's the vibe, and him just being like, yes, this is it. Not y'all, not how your life is going, not what you're doing, but this thing that we're doing here of gathering together and feeling our feelings and being present to one another, being hospitable to one another, to the fact that the Pharisees can even know this is happening, right? Like, what kind of open door policy is that? Where the judger is still sitting there witnessing this, like, that must be a holy space to be able to hold its integrity in the midst of that. And then he quotes Hosea. He says, go learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now that quote comes out of Hosea chapter 6. And Hosea chapter 6 is all about how Israel, the nation, has just totally screwed it up and deserves all punishment and all wrath in the world. They have turned away from God consistently. They are violent. They are disrespectful. They are dishonoring. They're self-indulgent. And they deserve all of the harm in the world. And God says, through Hosea, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. What does it mean? What does it mean to you in your life right now if God is asking you to find mercy, not sacrifice?
Can we define sacrifice?
Sure. So in the modern world, we have a very different understanding, I think. So I appreciate that you lifted that up. In the Hebrew world, in the world where Jesus occupies, sacrifice is an action that you do to make yourself right with God. It's an act of fixing things, right? So you get your animals and you bring them to the temple and you sacrifice them. They are ritually slaughtered in order to make right something that's going wrong. Now, sometimes there's also sacrifices that are about giving thanks and giving an offering or a gift. And actually, the temple system is actually designed to distribute those those actual bodies, that meat, that food, to distribute it to those in need in the community. So sometimes we get this really problematic painting of the temple as this real problem, but actually it's a wealth redistribution system, right? And the wealthy are expected to bring big, large, beautiful animals, and the poor can bring relatively inexpensive, commonplace animals. And it is a system for wealth redistributions. But the idea of sacrifice is something that you do of your own will and accord to make things right, to settle accounts, so forth. So when God says through Hosea, I desire mercy, not sacrifice.
Well, mercy is an internal shift. You're changing your perception, your feelings, you're thinking about what's going on. The sacrifice sounds very external. I did this thing, check, and it doesn't do anything internally. It doesn't affect your emotions in any way, as far as I could tell.
Sure. External versus internal, sacrifice versus mercy.
He does say something, he, she, they says something about the temple business as, being wrong. When you go mercy versus sacrifice, it's about the temple as well.
And we could get into what the specific critique is in that moment of the cleansing of the temple if we want, but maybe we'll save that for another time. So I was talking about this with a Bible study group the other day, and I was noting how mercy is not compassion, right? God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And I was thinking about the concept of mercy. When I think about mercy, I think about someone powerful and entitled, almost condescending to someone with less status than them. I'm going to show you mercy out of my power, out of my privilege, out of my authority, out of my whatever, right? And I was thinking about how both mercy and sacrifice still have this person with a lot of agency and a lot of power to act in the world. And so I'm thinking about these Pharisees and thinking about how they really believe that they are super powerful. They believe that they are really in control of their own purity. They're in control of their own lives. They're doing right by God. And everybody else should be more powerful like they are. Everybody else should have more control over themselves, more control over reality, if we could just be this way. And so I think Jesus is trying to speak to them where they are. He's not trying to call bullshit on them yet. This is the amazing thing. Even with Jesus talking to people that are doing emotional violence to his people, he still starts with meeting them where they are, meeting them in their scripture, meeting them in the thing that they see as authoritative in their life, and says, go and learn what this means. Because when you have critiques of your people, well, I've heard this before. I've read the prophets. And when they talk about critique for their people, what's God's response? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now maybe, just maybe, they'll get the other thing he said, which is, I've come not to call the righteous, but sinners, and they'll be like, oh, the righteous is a zero-sum category. Maybe they'll get that later. Maybe they'll realize that they're not actually in the righteous category because there's no one in the righteous category. But right now, I don't think they're there. And so even Jesus kind of connects with them where they are. I want to ask one last question. What's it been like for you as you've learned to separate your feelings from your judgments? I'll just tell you really quickly, I have a huge pet peeve when somebody says, I feel like you're trying to. I'm like, nope. That's not a feeling. That's a little bit calling bullshit. Like, I really should be better at staying over here and be like, oh, tell me more about the thing you think. Right? And be a little bit kinder about it, but I'm not. I'm like, that's not a feeling. Do I need to get out a feelings wheel? We'll do that. I have a pillow of a feelings wheel in my house, in my living room right now, just in case. And we've gone to it multiple times to get some language on this. Have you had an experience of starting to separate out your feelings, your actual feeling words, anxious, distracted, frustrated, fearful, desiring control, rigid, from your judgments?
The few times I've done that, the judgment kind of disappeared. It was all my feeling. It was the judgment.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't anything really external.
Sure. But once you actually addressed the feeling, the judgment didn't seem as relevant anymore.
Right, disappeared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sometimes when there are external reasons why you feel the way you're feeling, maybe judgment could be replaced with analysis, and because you need to sometimes figure out external factors, how they make you feel, and if you can do anything about that, if you can change anything. So judgment or analysis doesn't automatically go away. You just have to sort of, discern them together.
Sure. One of the things I notice about when I start differentiating these things is that I clarify what's my work and what's not my work. When I'm so focused on my judgment, the work is somebody else's work. But when I can be like, you are trying to harm me. Well, I don't actually know that. I feel you're trying to know. I believe you're trying to harm me. I feel scared because I believe that you're trying to harm me. Just think about if somebody says that to you, I feel scared because I actually believe you're trying to harm me, versus if they say, you're trying to harm me. Or even if they say it gently, you're trying to harm me. Oh man, am I defensive as shit when somebody says that to me. But when they start with their feeling, I'm like, oh, I need to care for that. Like, oh, you're afraid because you believe I'm trying to harm you? Well, I don't want you to be afraid. What am I doing? Right? Like it just moves the center on it. The trick is, how do you do that with yourself? When it's not about somebody else. And oftentimes we have a feeling and then we have a judgment about the feeling, and we don't recognize we're actually having a feeling about the fact that we're having a feeling. I feel like this is getting convoluted.
I have one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one thing that helps me a lot is, most of us are not surrounded by psychopaths. So I just assume all the time what anybody around me does is the best that they can do at the time. I mean, I do not assume somebody is trying to harm you or anything, because that takes, that charge out of it.
Right, and I think the thing that's important about that, and thank you for getting me back on track, the thing that's important about it is arriving to the present moment of your own feeling about it. Whatever someone is doing, we can't be in their head, right? We can have judgments and we can think we know, just like the Pharisees think they know who these sinners and tax collectors are and think they know what their worth is and whatever. We can have judgments about that. But if we can center into our feelings, like if the Pharisees were clear about their feelings, what are they really feeling? They're feeling afraid that their nation is being lost. I mean, think about how a lot of people on the religious right are feeling. They're terrified that their country is slipping into moral decline. They're fearful. They're deeply fearful. And the way that they're manifesting that is through all this garbage of control and management. And we'll censor, we'll ban the books, and we'll reduce the classes, and we'll outlaw these performances and whatever. They're so afraid. And I just see Jesus just deeply, deeply wanting to call bullshit. Like profoundly wanting to call bullshit. But how does he show up? He just shows up and is settled and wants to walk them back. How is that for you? He really cares. If he cares about me, he's got to care about them too, because I'm not that special. Once we can arrive to the present moment, once we can allow ourselves to show up to how it really is for us, then we can receive what God has for us. And once we can really arrive for other people, then I think the work that God has can start working and moving in their lives. Jesus says at the end of this section that the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. We don't need more self-righteous assholes out there telling people who's in and who's out and what's good and what's not. We don't need more people calling bullshit, actually, surprisingly. We're all very good at that, mostly on ourselves. Like, we're awesome at calling bullshit on ourselves. You know what we're not awesome at? That thing that makes calling bullshit work, which is showing up and settling down, and welcoming the present moment and all the feelings that are there. It's that change in our heart that makes all transformation possible.